excited to have you. We're going to be talking about a very interesting topic, agile big room planning, how to stay agile in a remote work environment. This topic is definitely something that many of us can relate to right now. Our presenters today, we have Memo de Anda, who is VP of Agile, COE with PK. Also joining Memo is Marcus Greenwood, who is the Director of Software Engineering and Wireless Technology with Charter Communications. Thank you for joining us for this webinar presentation. A few quick notes before we begin. We will be taking questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So please, happy to hear from you guys through chat, but if you have any questions, please submit it through the Q&A and we will devote the last 10 minutes or so to answer those questions in here on this webinar. Because this is a webinar format, all attendees are muted. But if you guys have any questions after the fact, we will be sharing the link to the recording, and Memo will also be sharing his information for any communications or questions. So without further ado, I am going to be turning it over to Memo to start this webinar.
Ms., thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Hope everybody's staying safe and healthy during these trying times. Very happy to be here. Thank you very much for joining us and taking an hour out of your time to, talk about this topic right now, which is virtual BRP webinar. So some of the things that we're going to be covering today is going to be really not just jump into the topic, which we will discuss in depth, but really what is the context of this from a digital perspective. So we'll talk a little bit about something called digital dynamics in the digital world and how that actually feeds and is a perfect backdrop for virtual BRP. Right, so we will be covering the successful model. It's a proven model. As we go through this, we'll talk a little bit about what goes into it, what needs to happen, what is that cycle of success to make sure that you actually get the outcomes that you're looking for, and what it takes to get to that point. And then towards the end, I'll hand it over to Marcus. As Ms. said, Marcus is the Director of Software Engineering for Wireless and Charter Communications. So he'll provide some insights and some remarks around his experience going through this virtual BRP model. Okay, so we'll spend about 15 minutes talking about the context of it. We'll spend 15 minutes going through the actual how to get this done, what kind of tools we leverage, and so on. And then I'll hand it off to Marcus for those 10 minutes before we jump into questions and answers. So the first thing, we really want to talk about is for some of you who haven't been familiarized with BRP. BRP stands for Big Room Planning. There are several other terms for it. The most common comes from SAFe, which we'll talk a little bit about as well, which is Program Increment Planning, right? Other folks still talk about it like Agile Release Planning, which is something not new. It's been around, since Scrum started out. So there are different versions to this, but what I want you to take away from it is at the end of the day is how do we plan large organizations, right? How do we plan as a program? How do we scale this? How do we scale the principles of agility into a very cohesive and proven repeatable model that's going to set us up for success, right? So to do this, we're going to talk about, well, what does it take from an organizational perspective to get to that point? And this section is called Digital Dynamics and in Nimble Organizations. So in terms of digital transformation, we know that it's not just about technology. So here you'll see 12 pillars or factors that really go into any digital transformation. Now, digital transformation, digital adoption, it's a term that's thrown around a lot, right? But if you look at this, it's really a lot of moving parts. It's not just the hardware, it's not just the software, right? Very important, but it's not just that, it's the humanware of it. So humans, our participation in this ecosystem, in this digital world now is really, really key, right? Because it's all about, well, how do we start defining process? How do we change our mindset to really adapt to this new world that we're living in, right? It's difficult. A lot of companies right now are, we're not set up from a digital perspective and are having a lot of challenges in adopting it, right? So you'll hear me talk about non-digital companies are back in the non-digital world, right? So the premise to that, when I talk about non-digital and digital, is, well, the ways of working have to also be different now. We have to adopt to a more digital age, right? So we'll talk about that in a bit. But what we want to represent here is these are the different pillars to digital transformation that an organization goes to. The yellow oranges, the ones that are colored in yellow, are really the pillars to a virtual BRP. So you'll think about things like customer focus, right? Are we actually customer centric? Does that mean, well, are we able to be nimble enough as an organization to actually keep pace with our customer demands, right? At the end of the game, it's all about providing value to customers. And that comes in different kinds of ways, right? So that's a factor to think about as we start moving towards, well, how do we do a virtual BRP? Is all of our backlogs, visions, products, is everything aligned to a customer focus? Organizational structure, which is that second part there, always really important, as well as, do we have any constraints from an organizational perspective that's going to allow us to do something like a virtual BRP, right? And if you think about it, a virtual BRP is a pretty heavy lift from an organizational perspective. It doesn't mean you have to go reorg, right? It's just, how do we start organizing teams around value? And these could end up being virtual teams. That's not a problem, right? But at the end of the day, is how do we align everything to make sure that we are still focused on the customer, right? So you'll notice these things are all intertwined. Number 3, change management. How do we actually change? How do we, do these little changes and make sure that these are changes that are anchored long-term, right? The best way to do this is looking at precision, which we'll talk about in a while, which is data. Is it making a sense for us to do it this way? If so, how do we make sure that that change is anchored and starts going from a change to actual way of working, and really start motivating that mindset, right? Transformational leaders, and this is something also that I'm sure you hear a lot about, is, well, it's up to leadership. It's up to leadership. And a lot of this is, from leadership perspective, it's that support, right? It's not, we're not saying, leaders go out and do it, but it's support the ecosystem, right? And that ecosystem is this digital adoption. And in terms of what that means for the virtual BRP, as you know, again, it's a huge shift of getting all these people across the organization in a room, right, virtually now, for 2-3 days to plan everything out. So it might seem like a great idea, but there's some economics thinking there. You have to take, like, well, how much is this investment gonna really cost me, and what is the output, right? Is there a return on investment in doing a virtual BRP? So all that conversation happens at a leadership perspective. And then the last one I have there in yellow is the evolution of products and process. So something we really have to take a look at too very closely is not only how do we evolve our products, right? How are we staying customer centric, but how do we evolve our processes with it, right? So the virtual BRP, the virtual big room planning, is a great example of how we've evolved our process from a physical exercise to now a digital virtual one, while still being able to deliver that value that we had when we were doing this physically, right? And here's a great little remark from Curtis Rasinger. It says, Darwin's perspective was actually not survival of the fittest, but the survival of the most adaptable, right? So basically, from a digital perspective, now we're looking at 5 characteristics of the digital world that we could harness to manage modern management methodologies. So what we're saying here is, from a management perspective, again, the non-digital way of managing teams, managing products, managing our software shops, right, is very different than it is now in this digital world. So it's all about these 5 characteristics that's going to really help us define that new way of working in this digital age. So I invite you to look at these and ask yourself these questions, right? We have 5 things: speed, adaptability, adjacency, scale, and precision. So from a speed perspective, ask yourselves, how do we execute faster while resisting unwise knee-jerk reactions and changes in our strategy? So what that means is, yes, we have to be faster. We have to make sure that we keep pace, to be able to provide our customers what they need, keep customer-centric and customer-focused. But how do we do that? How do we plan enough to stay nimble and actually deliver that? The flip side to that, or the other side of the coin, is If you do too much planning, too much strategizing, you might box yourself in your organizational structures, right? And that's where you start having this inability to actually adapt to changes that are coming down the pipeline, or that the customers are really setting that pace, right? So that's where we go into the adaptability part of it. So to be able to adapt is, how do we reduce unnecessary organizational constraints to take maximum advantage of digital malleability? So again, this is a question that you got to ask yourself is, truly, what are the organizational constraints that we have right now that does not allow us to be nimble, right? How do we make sure that we are able to adapt to change so we can harness that speed? So notice how all this stuff is interconnected. An example I always use is, when you're building a house, it's easy to plan for it because there aren't going to be a lot of changes, right? 4x4s aren't going to get any bigger. The land's not get any bigger, right? You already have a structure in place where you don't have to be nimble. That's okay. But we can't take that mindset and that way of managing projects into this new digital world. So speed, adaptability, adjacency, which I feel is probably one of the most important, all of them are important, but this one really is key to highlight, is how do we connect internal teams to more information, right? So internally, your organization, services and collaboration than ever before, while providing more transparency. So another way to look at this is, how do we eliminate silos within the organization to allow us to be more adaptable and allows us to actually harness speed? So adjacency is key for virtual big room planning. This is one of probably the most principle, or the principle that's mostly focused on, that is adjacency, bringing teams together, right? Regardless of where they report up to, regardless of what their individual teams KPIs or whatever that might look like, how do we bring them together and align them to what we saw on the other slide, which was a product-centric vision, a change management, and how do we evolve this process, right? One of the biggest challenges we see that we also have to look inwards and ask ourselves as an organization is, how do we scale our workforce without falling into a non-digital trap, right? So the problem about scaling, it is challenging, right? What works for 1 or 2 Scrum teams might not work for 3, 5, 7, 10, or 15, right? That would usually go into a big room planning. So the question is, how do we scale without actually falling into old habits of, oh my God, we need more project managers to be able to manage all these dependencies, right? We need more and more to be able to sustain this scalability. So it's actually not about how do we do more, to sustain that, is how do we actually do this with the least overhead possible? And the way we do that is by being adjacent, right? Keeping it as one single unit of work. Precision, also, let's ask ourselves, how do we become more data driven? We need to take the objectivity, the subjectivity from all this stuff, and look at it as from an objective perspective. Look at data, what works, what doesn't work, right? And that's going to also help you justify a change management approach. The only way you're going to anchor changes, and when I talk about anchor changes in this context, is from virtual BRP. How do you make that part of your DNA now? And it has to be driven by data, meaning, was it worth it? Did we get what we want to? Are we able to measure all these important things that go into that? So precision, always when you see precision, think about data. What are we measuring? So let's talk about key factors for a remote facilitation. So we know from an organizational perspective now what it takes to actually get to this point where we can adopt something like a virtual big room planning. Virtual big room planning is a lot more than just, putting something on an invite on a calendar and saying, hey, 200 people show up to this WebEx, right? It's not a very effective way to have big room planning. So some of the key factors for remote facilitation, and the spoiler alert, it is a people thing. As I mentioned, hardware, software, these things are easy in a digital dynamics world. The most difficult part is the humanware, right? It's the personalities, it's the processes, it's the adoptions, the change management. Interesting stat that I saw again this morning, right? 48% of companies say that their biggest challenge to adopt any new way of working is just really, there isn't that mindset to try new things, right? So it's all about the structures we've done before, and it's difficult to adopt new ways of working without having value or something that's going to help drive that data to make sure that we make the right decisions. So what we do is, in terms of facilitation, leverage SAFe as a body of knowledge. Now, I'll put it out there, there are different frameworks for scaling. You have LESS, you have SAFe, which is one of the most popular, more commercial, and you have other stuff, right? Spotify, just kind of a parenthesis, Spotify was actually not brought up as a framework, right? The Spotify model worked for Spotify because you're Spotify. So I've seen companies that say, I've tried Spotify model, it doesn't work. Well, Spotify worked for Spotify. It's not going to work with it for anybody else. They were able to create their own framework, right? And that's something that I think all companies need to shoot for. But given what we have right now, leverage SAFe as a great body of knowledge. You have to recognize that SAFe does a great job in terms of putting information together. If any of you have been through a SAFe training, you'll notice how they talk about lean agile principles, lean agile processes, the mindset, and product customer centricity. All that is great. One anti-pattern that I see is trying to use SAFe as a prescriptive process. So I've been involved with SAFe ever since they were SAFe 3.0, maybe about 8 years ago, and worked with several companies since then. And I've never seen a company adopt full SAFe from a portfolio perspective. So that should not be your end game. Again, right? The objective here is not to be safe. The objective here is to adopt body of knowledge, using your change management, your product centric strategy to do what works best for you as a company, right? So a few things that we leverage in virtual BRP from SAFe, again, as a body of knowledge, is definitely organize team around value. Look at the product vision, right? That's going to help us really be aligned to continue to be customer centric. A roadmap, one thing is the vision, and then roadmap is going to be the steps to get there. And inspect and adapt, which we'll chat at towards the end. And of course, PI planning, which is big room planning. And again, I can't say it enough, right? Use SAFe as a body of knowledge, not as a prescription for a process. So now we're at this stage where let's talk about what remote virtual big room planning model, what does it take, right? So there are three main pillars from our perspective that you have to take into account for these. One is tools that are engaging and that are fun. Okay, this has to be fun. If you think about it, you're 2-3 days locked in pretty much in a virtual room, I would say, and you might not have that ability that you used to have physically, where you would go out, talk to friends, right? And it makes you more engaged. So right now, it's how do we leverage technology and tools that are actually fun to keep people engaged. One vision I have, hopefully it'll come true someday, is imagine having a virtual BRP in Animal Crossings, right? Can't imagine it being more fun than that. Everything's happening in Animal Crossings now. If you're a Nintendo fan, you know what I'm talking about. But those are the kind of collaboration and engagement tools and techniques that really do keep people engaged, right? So when we talk virtual, we're talking about really not just from a remote perspective, is how do we create that virtual presence and essence of collaboration between teams, right? That's what it's about. Expert facilitation, again, tools, like I mentioned, right? Hardware, software, all this great stuff is very key to it. But again, the humanware of it is what's going to drive it. I was talking yesterday to one of our somebody on the team. We're talking about that, right? The importance of being able to harness both facilitation, humanware, and the tools. And he said something very funny. It was like, well, if you hire a plumber, right? Plumber's not going to come home and then just give you the wrench, right? You're not really asking him to come in just because of the wrench. He's going to use a wrench. He's going to use his experience. He's going to use his expertise, leverage that wrench, the tool, to actually get the job done and provide value, right? So at the end of the day, don't just focus on the wrench. Focus on that facilitation technique and the humanware that's going to take to actually wield that wrench. So that's where expert facilitation, again, humanware is key on how we're going to use the tools. Tactical outcomes. Can't say this enough. I've seen some anti-patterns where there's, we go through a virtual BRP or any BRP, and it turns out that, the outcomes were not clear. So we can get lost in the planning, but if we are not aligned to outcomes, that's really going to drive to that ROI and increase that value to customers, then something's wrong with the process. So these are the three main pillars: fun tools, expert facilitation, and definitely drive towards tactical outcomes. And tactical outcomes, just a little, additional information on that. I'm talking about business objectives. I'm talking about full features that are actually, we could get to the hands of our customers to improve their expertise, or I'm sorry, their experience. Features are behaviors of a system. That's the best way to look at it. So fun tools. Here are a few examples of some of the tools that we've leveraged. One of them is, for example, Sococo, which we'll see a few screenshots of what that looks like and how we were able to really harness that engaging effect that Sococo has. But it gives you the ability to do, management of people, right? So facilitation, management of people through this platform. It looks very much like a video game. Maybe you've seen it before. If you haven't, we'll see some screenshots and we'll walk you through what that was like. For planning, PI planning app. It's a great app that gives you that same experience of having a lot of people in front of a flip chart, moving stickies around, having this conversation, connecting dependencies. The reason you really want to look at something like PI planning app as opposed to just leveraging your internal Jira or Jira Align, if that's what you're using right now within your company, it's that we've seen time and time again that the tools actually become a constraint during planning. So instead of focusing on how we're going to plan and how we're going to deliver value to the customers, it turns into this just, conversation around we're not leveraging the tool correctly. We're not creating the features in the right way. We're not mapping dependencies in Jira Align. Get the tools subject matter expert. We're struggling to do this. So PI planning app is very simple. I'll show screenshots as well of what that looks like. And the cool thing about that is at the end, you can actually export the information and re-import it into Jira. So you don't have to worry about having a war with the tools during the planning session. Retrospectives, we use Fun Retro, which is something that is actually, I believe it's free. We used it free. There's a ton of retrospective tools out there. This is one that we use. For confidence vote, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, is something called Easy Polls. Okay, so this is some of the fun tools that we use in engaging tools. From a facilitation perspective, as I mentioned, it's really important to have the main facilitator here. He can't do it by himself, right? You're talking about a virtual big room planning will have somewhere from 50 to 100 people in it, right? So you do need support from Scrum Masters and product owners to be properly trained, at least a few workshops to be able to deliver this value. But the main subject matter expert, the person who's hosting this thing, has to be somebody who's really experienced with a program level facilitation, right? So again, facilitation, very important. This person is he's hosting, coordinating, was part of the prep work, which we'll see what that goes into. Make sure that he or she is driving all these outcomes and supporting, having conversations with executives, which is really important, right? There's also a certain skill set that's needed to those types of things. So here we have a few skills that you would need to be able to fill this role. But no, again, this is one of the most important pillars of a virtual big room planning. This is what the cycle looks like in terms of quarterly execution. So I want to be very careful here, because quarterly execution means you're doing a program, you're doing quarterly planning. If you're using your safe term, program increment, right? It might be 3 months, it might not be 3 months. We've seen a lot of success in aligning these to your fiscal quarters. So there's all these parts that happen to it, right? That happen with it, which is like readiness, pre-work, the actual big room planning, post-work, and inspect and adapt. So from a readiness perspective, these are the things you have to address in your organization, which is definition of ready, organizational readiness, content readiness, and virtual capabilities. So definition of ready, just like you would for an iteration, is what is your list of the minimum things you need to be successful in this execution? So a few things, I can think about. Do you have a proper, very well-refined feature backlog, right? That is key. That's going to drive a lot of this. Do you have a product vision, right? Do we have an architectural vision? Do we have an architectural roadmap? These are the things that need to meet a definition of ready for you to be successful in this cycle. From an organizational perspective, you have to ask yourself, who do I need in these 2 days or these 2 or 3 days? Do I need to pull architects teams? Do I need to pull UI, UX? Everybody that's needed to deliver an experience. Okay, so that's very key, is how do I organize around value from an organizational perspective? Is what do I need to deliver an experience, not a component. A component by itself is useless. Is customer experience. What do those teams look like? Content. You will be going through PowerPoint presentations during this time, so it's really important that you help create from a business perspective. What is the state of the business? What is the product vision? What is the architectural vision? All these things, that would be the content that we would be talking about and reviewing as we go through these 2 or 3 days of big room planning. And virtual capabilities finally is, what do we have to actually leverage like I said, the virtual engagement, right? What are our fun tools that we have? What can we use? What might not work? What do we have currently that might not work, right? A good example is, if you just have a WebEx and you have a PowerPoint going through this for 2 days, you might not get, even though it's outcome driven, the engagement might fall short, and that might impact your outcomes. So here's a good tip in terms of pre-work. So things you have to look at pre-work is, we develop a tracker. We'll call it tracker, but basically what it is, it's a work back plan from the day we want to start to what the time remaining to get to that point and get to the definition of ready looks like. And you'll have things like, well, do we have a date confirmed? Do we have the attendance list? Do we have the commitment of the leaders to be in there? BRP requires, for it to be successful, you need leaders there to make decisions on the fly. Are these projects or products funded? Or do we have dependencies that we have to maybe assess if it's the right moment to do this? Based on the planning, we might not be able to do this. So decisions that we don't really want to have decisions on them later, but during those 2 or 3 days. 2 things that are really important for here, and I put them on in red down there, is role-based training. So these are just workshops, right? From a SAFe perspective, you might say, I don't have time to go through a 2-day SAFe training right now. I need other types of information. A workshop, a 2-hour, 1-hour workshop that is role-based. What will the product owners be doing during the BRP? What will the Scrum Masters be doing? What will the directors be doing? What would our VP be doing? All these things you could do in an hour, 2-hour workshop, right? Focused specifically on what needs to happen during that big room planning. So again, people management and people management and the way that we're going to synchronize the work and the conversations. We use these 2 tools. We'll see. Here is a screenshot of what Sococo looks like. So this is actually, it's really interesting because it provides that engagement in terms of like a video game, right? It feels like a video game. You get your little avatar there. For example, this is me right here by myself, but I'm represented in an avatar, and these are split between rooms. So each one of these rooms could essentially be your breakout rooms for your teams. For those of you who don't know what a breakout is during the BRP, is the time, it's actually the biggest chunk of time where the developers work to break features into stories and talk about the dependencies and what it's really going to truly take to get that done, right? So you would be able to have all the teams split here in these virtual rooms, and each room would have its own WebEx or its own Zoom or whatever you might be using, its own access and instance to their PI planning app, which is this. So they would be doing their iteration planning through each one of these, just like moving stickies around, right? And the cool thing about this, though, as I said, all these little iteration plans roll up to a program board. So at the end of the day, what you're going to be able to get from this is a visual like this here. Sorry, it's not zoomed in, but you have all the teams that are involved. So if you have 10 teams there, and the iterations and all their dependencies, right? So you might say this is really easy in terms of facilitating and using and communicating what you wanted to communicate in terms of dependencies and milestones, releases, dependencies between the teams. But at the end of the day, you might say, well, I need this in my tool now. I need this in Jira or Jira Line or Rally, whatever you may be using, TFS, DevOps, Azure. You're actually able to export this information and re-import it. So that way you don't have to worry about your actual enterprise tool at that moment. If you have some restrictions, you could just do this, get it done with, and then export it into the tool. Here's a quick glance of what the agenda might look like, right? And remember what you're trying to do here, and this is an example of 3 days, not 2, but during the BRP, these are the things that you have to knock out. Is definitely, get a message from leadership. What is it that we want to accomplish? Something that's inspiring. Talk about the vision, right? The product roadmap. What are those features that we need to finish this quarter to be successful and meet those business objectives? The product roadmap is going to tell you how to get there. There's an architectural roadmap that we have to discuss and how it's going to interact. Very important. And then facilitator provides a breakout guidance, which is basically, you know, what's going to go into those breakout sessions in terms of breaking features into stories, and then having that ability to communicate and leverage the knowledge and the decision making you have in that virtual room, right? Day two, again, you would do breakout sessions, review the plans, management review, and so forth. So I won't spend too much time on these agendas. There's some good examples you could download from or take a look at, you know, in the internet. But overall, you have to make sure that you knock out most of these things, because each one of them has a reason to be there, and it actually drives a very tangible outcome at the end of the day. Post work. Another thing you want to focus on is that the big room planning is just the beginning, right? The execution of that plan is what's going to matter. So it's really important to always focus not just on the BRP, which is a lot of pre-work, but coming out of that, you should have outcomes, which are going to be, this is a roadmap. We have iterations already locked as much as possible. We're going to stay nimble, as we talked about at the beginning of the presentation. We're going to be able to adapt to change because we are an adaptable organization. So all these things are key factors in making sure that the execution of that plan is successful. It's not just about the BRP, it's just the beginning. It's the execution that's going to make you successful. And at the end, you want a closure to that, right? So inspect and adapt, look at it as a retrospective for the entire execution of that quarterly plan or that big room planning. And what it is at the end is you're taking some time to do a retrospective. And retrospectives, I'm kind of stickler for that, because you don't want to have a conversation with 200 people that just say, what went well, what didn't go well, what can we improve? You know, it takes some time. There's a ton, there's books out there, there's websites dedicated that provide hundreds of ways to actually run a fun and engaging retrospective. And at the end, you're getting what you need, right? Which is, what did we do that that didn't go too well, but what can we improve on, right? This is really important. It's that moment where you pause, you look back, and you actually celebrate the accomplishments, but take note of what needs to improve in the next one. If you don't do this, you know, you might be falling into the habit. It becomes a habit of the same obstacles and failures that you might not recognize unless you stop to take a look, right? So this is what it is, what you know, the virtual BRP is, how we run it, what tools we've utilized and leveraged. So I'd like to take this moment to hand it off to Marcus Greenwood, again, who is Director of Software Engineering for Wireless at Charter Communications, and talk about his experiences, his insights going through this virtual BRP model. Marcus, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Memo. Happy to be here today to kind of share our experiences. You know, I'll give you a little background just to kind of start with. Our team's, you know, kind of a mid-sized team. We've been doing BRPs probably for about 1.5 years now, and in more of the traditional sense where we have everybody, you know, joined all in one room, you know, kind of what Memo was speaking to previously. But, you know, the challenge was, you know, when the COVID situation hit is, you know, how do we keep that same kind of structure? How do we keep that same value from our BRPs going forward into this virtual world? You know, there was plenty of options thrown to us that, hey, maybe we throw everybody into one large video conference and we try to do everything manually that way. But as he showed you, there was quite a few tools. Go ahead and go to the first slide there, Memo. You know, this is a good screenshot of Sococo. You know, as a team, we decided, hey, we're going to embrace some of these other tools. We checked out, you know, different variations and settled on Sococo to help us, you know, at least organize it. The nice thing about this tool was that it allowed us to be able to get everybody all in a kind of a picture to be able to see where people are at, organize all of our different video conferences and structure our BRP very much how it would be if we were really together on site in a non-virtual world. The cool thing here is that it allows us to kind of organize and then select where people need to be. You know, we can organize around, especially as a leader myself. You know, I was used to, in a traditional sense, being able to walk across and you know, help all the teams, be able to solve problems, talk through issues and stuff. But I would typically do that in a roaming fashion. This tool allowed me to kind of see, where teams were actively participating, where some teams maybe were taking different approaches and things, and they could ping me directly. So go ahead and go to the next slide. Memo. Yeah, so you can see this is kind of a before and after. This is our team initially kind of in a room. Our team is really about 55 people broken up into 7 or 8 different work streams. This was one team kind of segmented into a room, and you can see we were talking through an issue with one of our stakeholders. Everybody engaged, but a lot of people that maybe were unnecessary for that thing, because we were rotating through and we were hitting where we could as stakeholders or as management. Afterwards, you can see when we kind of moved into the virtual Sococo land, we broke everybody up into their respective areas, as you can kind of see on the screenshot here. The interesting thing there was they could ping me when they needed something from me or from another stakeholder and say, hey, we need some help. And they could, then I could jump over there. I could pull others in with me who were necessary, rather than taking, stakeholders along with me that weren't necessarily, ready, because we didn't know what situation, we might encounter. So it was kind of nice to be able to organize a little differently that way. We did lose a little bit of the human touch in some cases. A lot of times we all were on video, and sometimes it's hard to tell expressions, but I think that's any challenge that we run into with video conferencing or other types of virtual tools. But it really did show that that the teams knew how to get a hold of me or other stakeholders. The one problem we did run into there was sometimes we were getting pinged to go to different places quite a bit. So we did offer office hours. There is a way where we could have our own little like leadership area within Sococo, or another little room for the different stakeholders, like product or whoever might be necessary. And so we'd go hang out there sometimes, and we would also say, hey, here's the times when we might be available, because I think they found it very easy to get a hold of us and be able to access us through the tools, which is a benefit, but also it makes it tough sometimes on us as leaders. But we did figure that out, and it actually worked pretty smoothly. Go ahead and go to the next screen there, Memo. Another, kind of, I guess, result of moving into, the tools, in a virtual sense versus the sticky notes that we did previously, because the sticky notes were easy. They're, everybody could annotate on them, and they could place them and move them around. We did find out that using the PI planning tool, there was a little more difficulty, because, we had to kind of think through things and type them in and get them placed. But the nice thing was, once everything was there and we needed to move them around, it was just as easy remotely to do that, as well as we had already captured the information, and we could, just push that over into our systems, into Jira and Jira Line very nicely. So not much of an impact there. I think a lot of the teams, like the digital side of it, at least the engineers do. I think the Scrum Masters might prefer the other side, because it's a little easier for them to move things around, but it definitely worked out well, so for us to be able to structure our stories and kind of work with that tool. Let's go to the next slide. So retrospectives. So this has always been an interesting one for us. We have traditionally done our retrospectives all together, and we had done it with sticky notes, and talked in front of the entire team all at once. We broke it out a little bit in the using this tool into the segmented teams, so that they could kind of also participate in voting on which ones were more important. We would do a confidence vote a lot of times on certain things throughout our planning, and we would do different mechanisms to kind of indicate what's more important. But the nice thing about this tool is it was able to utilize a mechanism for us to track the important pieces, and everybody could anonymously vote on which ones they thought were more important than the others. That way, I think it gave the opportunity for some of the folks on the team to number one, enter some of the retrospective items that they normally wouldn't speak up to in front of a group, but it would allow them to anonymously propose something, and then also, weigh in on which ones they felt were important. So that anonymity kind of helped, I think, with that. And this tool was something we'd already used even prior to going completely virtual. But it was really fun to see some of the teams comment after the fact, saying, "Hey, we love the retro this time because everybody was remote." And so people couldn't always guess who was, proposing some of the changes. And it felt like we really did get a lot of good feedback, even feedback, for, our process, but also for management to understand, hey, maybe we can do things a little differently next time. And it was really well organized. So that was another area that I felt like, we utilized the tool and our virtual setup to kind of make additional value from our retrospective aspect. Let's go to the next one. And here's another, I don't know, I think dependencies are always interesting, and this kind of shows, how we had done it previously with some of the manual, kind of strings tying them to the user stories and things that were input. It's always been funny because I think as engineers, we think of things very, very differently. And, in this case, the tool was helpful here, but I'm not sure we leveraged the full capability of understanding that difference between a virtual versus what we had done, before by attaching strings to it. One of the teams that I manage had some key dependencies on an outside team, and so it was a little tough for us because we didn't pull that work in from the other team and tie it into the system. Whereas before, we would just indicate those things and we'd draw another card and it was really easy. So it was a little more difficult in this case to kind of really implement that. I think, being prepared is something that Memo was talking quite a bit about in some previous slides there. And I think that would be one of those things that I would do differently coming into the setup and logistics for our next PI planning, is to ensure that we've got all of the requisite teams, all of the dependent teams that we can identify, and make sure that those are into the system, because I think it really does go a long way to making sure that the preparation for a virtual BRP it seems to take a little more, is what I guess my point is there. It's definitely something you have to think about because, well, it was our first one as well. It wasn't like we'd had a lot of practice doing these previously, and over time I think we will get better at that. But it definitely shows that there's always some details that need to be ironed out more with how we're doing it now, or at least it seems like it's more than what it was. All right, the next slide. Yeah, so this was also about confidence votes. So as I was kind of mentioning, and I think I probably jumped ahead a little bit on some of this, but we also wanted to make sure our teams could do a confidence vote on their stories and how well they felt coming out of planning for individual stories. It was hard because we were thinking initially that we would do this using a WebEx and everybody would just put up their hand, but it's impossible to look at everybody's screen and see what their hand is. So it's really tough for us. And when we found a tool that would help us with this, it made it easier. I'm still thinking that when we're live and doing a confidence vote, people look at each other and they kind of play off of like maybe the leads or others. I noticed that some of that usually takes place where somebody's nervous to put up their hand until they see maybe one of their leads or another person on the team give their recommendation. And so this took all of that out of it, right? Because everybody was remote, unless they were chatting amongst themselves or doing something on the side, it seemed to go pretty well because everybody was isolated and to give their own vote, in their own sense. So, kind of another interesting fact, I guess, coming out of that is that it's one of those areas where you don't think about all of the little intricacies of doing something remote versus a simple thing like a confidence vote, that when you're doing it live, you get a little more of that, feedback and interaction of the team. Whereas when you're doing it remote, it's very siloed. So I think it went well, and we got pretty good results. Everybody was pretty confident in most things. So, I think the major concerns were raised, as those came up. So, so far so good with that too.
Absolutely. Okay. Thank you very much, Marcus. And, this is, I would say, also one of the most important outcomes is the ability for the teams. You think about that a little bit. The teams that are actually going to do the work, we're giving them the opportunity to express their concerns, right, before we lock in that plan. So if you look at this, I mean, we're talking about around 50 people here, 50 to 60 people voting and saying, well, worst case, I have a few concerns, but overall, I feel confident that we will this will come together, right? Or I feel confident enough that we will get this done, or at least most of it. So what you want to ask from a confidence perspective or commitment perspective is two parts. One is commit to the plan that we all have confidence in, or commit to raising your hand the moment you feel that there's something that's putting this plan at risk. So it's really always important when you close out these BRPs to have that distinguished, because commitment is a strong word, right? A lot of people might see it like, wow, I'm forced to do this even though I don't have control over the whole thing. But it's really confidence on the plan that you as a team created, right? So that's a power in that. It's how confident are you in the plan you created, right? And leadership here has supported you the last 2 days. So how confident are you? And can you commit to raising your hand when you feel, something's going to really impact that plan throughout the execution? So it's really important that throughout the execution, we continue to have that communication from the teams. So at the end of the day, the teams is what drives the outcomes. We just got to give them that space and support to be able to do that, right, through facilitations and tools. Exactly. So thank you very much, Marcus, for your insights. Thank you very much for sharing. Now, finally here, the last thing is, what are the outcomes of what we're looking for? Well, there's really 5 things here, which is a bottom-up feature delivery capacity plan designed for the team that will actually do the work. So here it becomes a little bit tricky, right? Because you might say, well, I don't need the whole team. Maybe I just, have the dev lead here come in and talk about it. But remember, they are teams, they're not individuals. So as a team, right, their confidence and their ability to plan together, to execute together, to learn together is what's going to make them a high optimal performing team, right? It's not, you're not going to do a lot good if you just have a few rock stars there. So you have to also support that kind of that growth in a team. Risk management of the things that might impact the quarterly plan. You find out about the dependencies within those 2 days of virtual BRP, right? You find out what the dependencies are, what the risks are, and they're known to everybody. So remember I talked about transparency at the beginning, and adjacency, that's what it's about. No secrets. This is what we know that could potentially impact. What do we want to do about it, right? At this moment, with the right people on the team, in the room, sorry. Transparency of the dependencies that the team will encounter. So again, this becomes a little bit of that adjacency part, right? Which is that transparency around, well, what might stop us? So these two are very close together, right? I would say they're coupled. Quarterly goals per team and how they contribute to the quarterly business goals. So from a business perspective, you usually do business quarterly business goals, right? It might come from business, product, whatever that might be. So at the end of the day is making sure that when we start decomposing that into a roadmap, that even at the story level, you still have an essence of that objective. So you don't want to lose the plot of the quarter, right? So you have to make sure that when you do this, that everything that's broken down has an essence and a contribution to that business objective and that business goal. And then at the end, a measure of the team's confidence on achieving the plan. So I can't say this enough, right? Giving that ability to the team to actually provide their input and their concerns is very powerful. At the end of the day, they're the ones who's going to build this, and they're the ones who know the system very well, can provide great feedback given that environment that we're able to provide as leaders. So with that, I want to thank you very much for your time. Thank Marcus very much for his contribution and sharing his insights. And I'll hand it over to Ms. for questions.
Thank you, Memo. Thank you, Marcus. This topic is really insightful. I personally am writing down a bunch of findings and notes. Like leaders of teams, many of the attendees on this call, I'm sure, can relate. Being in a remote setting has given us some new challenges to deal with. And I think when we are in a position to manage teams and in a remote setting and trying to still instill this dynamic, interactive environment, and get people engaged and motivated is hard. And so I think navigating the process, understanding the tools is so incredibly important. Thank you for sharing your insights. We do have a couple of quick questions here that I want to throw it out to both of you guys. A few people have asked about just kind of team size. Like how many teams do I need to really manage to get value out of this? What if I'm only managing 2 or maybe just even 1? Can I still apply this framework for that size?
I would say absolutely. And that's a really good question, a very common question. I think, again, if you look from a safe perspective, they'll say, well, you want an agile release train to be between 50 and 125. I agree with the limit, right? You don't want to have more than 125 people because the lines of communication start to get distorted, and it's really hard to have that type of alignment, right? So one of the principles is always focus on small batches of work and small teams as much as possible, right? So you want to make sure you don't go over 100-ish folks in that minimum. Because this is a scaled approach, right? You really want to make sure that you're building this out for maybe at least, I would say, 4 to 10 teams might be a good point. But I think the rule of thumb is if you are having challenges right now with a couple of teams, with the 2 teams, this might be a good approach, right? It might actually be easier, and it'll give you a good baseline to start scaling. So quick answer is yes, absolutely. You could do this with 2, 3 teams, not a problem. Just make sure you limit the high end, right? That you don't have more than 100 people, 125 people in this thing.
Awesome. Somebody just asked about just, addressing these issues with team members in different time zones.
Yeah, that's that's always a concern. And even as we were doing, physical BRP, that's a great question. And one of the things that we've seen work, again, it's very different from organization to organization. So it's really hard to just give one right answer and say, this is the way you got to do it. But in my experience, we've experimented with different time zones. So it always has to be a balance, right? We work with offshore teams a lot. And one of the things we tried at the beginning was for a virtual BRP was, well, let's start early for onshore hours, and it's going to be a little bit late for offshore hours, right? And we'll cut the amount of time. So instead of doing maybe 3 days, we might spread it maybe into 4. So we make sure that's shorter sessions. But you start at 7 in the morning onshore, right, and go towards 11, and offshore it might be something like 8 o'clock to 11 o'clock, something like that. So it's always finding that it's 2 things: finding the balance, right? We want to have respect for people's environments and which time zone there are, because realistically you don't want folks tired, right? It's not going to be productive. And making sure that from an offshore perspective, you have proxies, meaning you have product owners, or you have people who could actually make product decisions on the fly as well. So I would just take into account those 2 things: balancing the time range before, shortening the amount, the duration of the BRP, or expanding days, and making sure you have the right people on those calls.
Great, thank you. This question is for Marcus. Somebody asked, did Charter create artifacts to share with the teams and stakeholders?
Yeah, actually we did. Our release train engineer helped kind of compile some of the lessons learned and some of the retro items so that we could pass that back to we have a central organization that kind of helps us with our safe implementation. And so we compiled those, we put them out. We have Confluence pages that have some of the best practices and some of the checklists that we started putting together on what to remember, each time we go through this, and to be able to share it to other teams so that as they, kind of join the release trains or jump into the big room plannings, that they'll have, that same, same guidelines and rules to kind of follow, or things that we learned, or at least that we published. So yeah, we did put some of those things together, but when we had a central team kind of organize it for us.
Awesome. Thanks, Marcus.
Sure.
we'll take one more question here. Somebody asked about, is it PL, be the same length every time? You guys see that question?
Yeah, I see
Is it
that. So,
considerations, or should it change every time? Can you guys maybe expand on that?
yeah. So that's a really good question. So program increments in general, right, should always be kept the same amount of length. The reason is, think about it, the only thing a program increment is a scaled version of an iteration or a sprint, right? So just like you would always have a 2-week sprint, the reason you have a 2-week sprint is because you provide cadence and predictability throughout time, right? So by having the iterations of program increments, the same amount of iterations, the same amount of sprints, right, always will provide easier predictability. So when you talk about roadmaps, for example, what's known as a program increment roadmap, you're usually planning this program increment, which is these upcoming, 8 to 10 or 7 and 9 iterations or whatever that might be. But you also have visibility into the next PIs. So I meant the next bundle of 8 iterations and the next bundle of 8 iterations after that. So the cool thing about this is really you have several benefits. One, it's predictable, right? When I say PI 5, you know exactly what that might entail. It gives you also the ability to synchronize calendars between several teams. So remember, here you might have a lot of dependencies. Maybe UI has another organization, APIs, quality, and all that. So this gives you a calendar for the next 3 PIs, right, with the same cadence and the same rhythm for all the teams. So when I go to another team that's outside of my organization and I say, we're going to work on this in the 3rd sprint of the PI 4, he knows exactly what I'm talking about, right? So that I would say, yes, always make sure to keep it the same amount of length as much as possible.
Awesome. One more last question. Last question.
You,
Are there other tools besides the ones that you mentioned that you guys would recommend to employ?
So, we did extensive research. The biggest one that we really wanted to solve for was the engagement part of it, which was Sococo. We found that was probably the best. Right now, one thing I've used that I could recommend as well in a smaller setting is use the breakout sessions ability and in Zoom. If you have Zoom, you have a breakout ability to break out rooms and assign people. Have done that in distributed or virtual training, and it's very effective, right? But that might not be something that you would use for a larger audience. Maybe if you have, the 20, 30 people, that might be okay, but larger, it gets a little sticky. But at this time, using Zoom, leveraging for that, the Sococo, okay, can't talk about it enough. Again, I hope Animal Crossings maybe create something we could use to do that, be fun. Yeah, but at this time, again, we saw several options, and Sococo was really the best one for engaging. Same for PI planning app. We wanted something simple that we could actually leverage the output and put it in our systems, and that was the best option. So there are a ton out there, but on the top of the mind, the ones that we recommended are the ones that we put a lot of effort into researching.
Awesome. Great. Well, it's at the top of the hour, so we are going to conclude the webinar. Memo's email is right on your screen. Please feel free to reach out to him if you have any follow-on questions after this webinar is completed. We will also be sharing the recording to everybody here. So please feel free to reach out with any questions or feedback. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you again for joining us. We look forward to having you as part of our next webinar. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.